Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dig into the source material to unpack an absolutely wild story, how a simple act of nostalgia ended up triggering a full-blown, continental-scale disaster in Australia.
So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, it all starts with this number, just 24. In 1859, that's literally how many rabbits it took to kickstart an environmental catastrophe that, believe it or not, Australia is still dealing with today.
Yup, you heard that right. It was an English settler, a guy named Thomas Austin, who was basically just feeling a little homesick. He missed the sport of hunting from back in England, so he intentionally set them loose on his property in Victoria. And those few animals, released just for a bit of fun, would go on to literally reshape an entire continent.
So the big question is, how on earth could such a tiny, seemingly harmless action lead to a disaster of this magnitude? Okay, let's break it down.
Okay, get this. The spread was it was stunningly fast. We're talking about the rabbit population expanding at over 100 kilometers a year. I mean, that's a speed most land mammals just can't match. You know that famous rabbit-proof fence? A huge, massive project? Yeah, it was a complete and utter failure. By the 1950s, the continent was overrun with an estimated 600 million rabbits. Let that sink in. 600 million.
Okay, so how is this even possible? What was it about Australia that made it so vulnerable? And what made the European rabbit such a perfect and devastating invader?
All right, this really gets to the heart of the problem. What we're looking at here is a classic case of what scientists call an evolutionary mismatch. Think about it. On one hand, you've got Australia. It's an ecosystem that evolved for millions of years all by itself, with no hard-hoofed, super fast-breeding animals like rabbits. The plants there just didn't have any natural defenses. And on the other hand, you've got the rabbit, a literal breeding machine that eats just about anything and had zero natural predators or diseases in Australia to slow it down. It was, quite literally, the perfect storm. And the impact? Wow, it wasn't just in one place. It was like a tidal wave that washed over the entire ecosystem. The rabbit stripped the land so bare that it led to massive soil erosion. This, in turn, just wiped out the homes of native animals, pushing a ton of them towards extinction, and on top of all that, it absolutely crippled Australia's agricultural economy. So, as you can imagine, as the crisis got worse and worse, Australia basically declared war on the rabbit. But this wasn't a war with guns and soldiers. No, this was a full-on biological arms race against nature itself. So in the 1950s, scientists brought out the big guns. They unleashed a new biological weapon, the Myxoma virus. And at first, the results were just staggering. In some areas, the virus wiped out over 99% of the rabbits. It really looked like they'd found a miracle cure. But there's always a but, right? This huge victory was actually hiding something that was bound to happen, something that perfectly illustrates this key idea. See, nature always fights back. A host, like the rabbit, and a pathogen, like the virus, they're locked in this constant evolutionary dance, where each one is always adapting to the other.
And you guessed it, that's exactly what happened. The few rabbits that had some natural resistance, they survived, and they bred, passing that resistance down to their offspring. But here's the really clever part. The virus also evolved. It became less deadly. Why? Well, think about it. A virus that kills its host too fast can't spread very far. So the rabbit population bounced back, and the humans were suddenly locked into this endless cycle of just trying to suppress the population, because completely getting rid of them was now off the table.
You know, the truly lasting damage wasn't just the stuff you could see, the bare earth, the erosion. No, the most profound damage was deeper, the stuff you couldn't see. A kind of debt that was quietly building up year after year. And this leads to a really fascinating, and honestly, a kind of scary idea. Scientists and people managing the landscape started to realize that the landscape they considered normal wasn't normal at all. It was just a shadow of what it used to be. Every new generation just accepted this more broken down version of the ecosystem as the baseline, as the new normal. It's like the memory of what a healthy landscape even looked like was being erased. And here's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. The rabbits didn't just cause damage by eating everything. They actually fueled a second wave of extinction. How? Well, their huge numbers created this all-you-can-eat buffet for other invasive species, like foxes and cats. But when the rabbit population would crash because of the virus, what do you think those supersized predator populations did? They switched targets. They started hunting Australia's vulnerable native animals, pushing so many of them right to the edge of extinction. Which brings us to this really powerful concept, ecological debt.
The damage wasn't just on the surface. No, it was in the very foundation of the ecosystem. We're talking about things like wiped out seed banks in the soil, a completely changed soil structure, lost nutrients. It's a debt that just keeps compounding, like credit card interest. It makes a full recovery almost impossible, even if you could magically make every single rabbit disappear tomorrow.
So, what's the lasting legacy of all this? What's the takeaway? Well, it turns out this one single event didn't just permanently change a continent, it fundamentally changed how we understand the environment itself. This led to a huge shift in thinking. It was basically an admission that, okay, we can't win this war. Total victory just wasn't possible. So the goal changed to something more like triage and emergency room, focus on saving the most important places, the high-value conservation areas, and just try to minimize the damage everywhere else. It was an acceptance that some of these ecological debts, well, they can never be fully repaid.
And you know what? The lessons from Australia's unwinnable war rippled out across the entire globe. The rabbit crisis is pretty much the reason we have the modern scientific field of invasion ecology. And all those strict biosecurity and quarantine laws you see at airports, the ones that countries all over the world now use, a lot of that thinking came directly from this experience, all in an effort to prevent the next rabbit invasion.
And this quote just sums it up perfectly. The rabbit isn't just some historical mistake you can erase. It has now become a permanent, living part of the Australian landscape. It's a biological scar left behind by a single decision made more than 160 years ago. Ultimately, this whole story is one of the most powerful reminders you'll ever get about how ecology works. It shows us that causing damage is often shockingly easy and incredibly fast. But fixing it? That's slow, unbelievably expensive, and a lot of the time, it's just not possible to get back to where you started. And it leaves us with a really tough question to think about. What are the rabbits that we're failing to see today? What are the small, seemingly harmless problems that could be spiraling out of control right under our noses?